Today, we're continuing in our series called Jesus Has Something to Say to His Church. And we're looking at the book of Revelation and the beginning, and there's this message that comes to John as he's on the island of Patmos, and Jesus tells him, write these letters to my church. And these are real churches in real cities that needed real messages. And there's words of encouragement and sometimes words of correction. And then the emphasis is to keep on going forward, to keep on staying faithful. And the title of my message today is called Preparing for Problems. Preparing for problems. Each of us face problems in our life, and if we're prepared for them, we can face them a lot better. When I got my driver's license, one of the things my dad made sure is I knew how to change a tire on a car. He didn't want me to get in the place where I needed to know how to face that problem, and he hadn't trained me to do so. And so we understand that it happens in life, but we really gauge our lives and direct our lives towards comfort, don't we? I mean, I stepped outside last night and had no idea it was that warm outside. Because we were in our temperature-controlled house. It was rainy. It was wet. I stepped outside expecting it to be cold, and I was like, oh, wow. Summer's here. Summer has finally arrived. We were driving to the YMCA yesterday, and I love our team, and I love that my family knows our team, and it was raining really hard, and we're taking our girls to swim lessons, and my daughter goes, Dad, this is a perfect day for Nick Sandy, our worship leader. He loves rainy days. I bet he's just outside laying in it today. And that was her mind. Like, if you love something, you're just out enjoying it. And so we understand that there's problems. We insulate ourselves from them. We've got comfy couches in our homes, even his and her couches, so you don't even have to share the couch anymore. We've got heated and cooled seats in our homes. We've got instant food. You drive through. You don't even got to pay cash anymore. You just give them a card. They give it back to you, and you never have to worry about it until the end of the month when the bill comes. We have lazy boys. We got big screen TVs that keep getting bigger. Right? They keep getting bigger. If you've been to Costco lately and you're like, yeah, 85 inches. That's about right. That's about what every home needs. And my wife's like, no, we're good. I was like, yeah, we're right. We're good. We're good. You know, and so we keep moving our lives towards comfort, but yet there's some areas of our lives that we are willing to sign up to challenge ourselves, to push ourselves, to get better and to grow. One of my dreams in life and one of my goals has to live my whole life never being punched in the face. Just a sensation I've never desired to experience. Some of you are like, oh no, sometimes it feels good, you know, and others of you are like, no, I've felt it. You just can keep avoiding it. And I want to let you know, today, you don't have permission to change that after this message. And so this is not an invitation, but it's been one of my goals. I've never had that desire sensation. Yet today, I want to invite my friend Josiah up. Josiah, come on up and join me. Josiah has a different goal than me. Josiah is an MMA fighter. Josiah actively has chosen to sign up to be punched in the face. And so Josiah, I want to talk to you today a little bit about a mindset that you've taken. I've known Josiah for a long time. Since he was 7 or 8 years old, I worked with his dad, and his dad had one of the great lines I've ever heard about raising his two boys. Your family is half Norwegian
and Samoan.
And half Samoan. So he said, my boys are half Viking and half warrior. If something burns or dies, that's just expected in our life. That's the type of boys we're raising from their heritage. But Josiah, you've chosen to sign up willingly. You're paying monthly. You are training hours and hours a week for problems.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that. Why did you sign up for that?
Well, like every fighter, they love watching the Rocky movies when they're kids, and then, you know, just whether you pursue fighting or you just watch it. But then I kept talking to kids at school, and they were like talking about fights coming up, and I'm like, man, Rocky would kick their butts, and they're like, that's not a real person. And I'm like, yeah, it is. It's not. But then I got older, and I just took it seriously and started taking care of my body, and just fell in love with fighting, which is crazy because people usually don't say that.
You see, I watched the Rocky movies too. And I said, I never want to get punched in the face. So we saw the same thing, enjoyed the same movie, but I'm like, Ivan Drago, that's a bad man.
I would love to fight him.
So, Josiah, you've made this decision. Talk to me about your training. How often do you train, and how difficult is it?
It's Monday through Friday, and like every other Saturday. And a short day is like 2 hours. If I can, I go for like 3. And it's not fun. It's fun, but it's like my friends and my teammates are attacking me for a couple hours, so it's like I got to stay sharp.
Yeah. So you've got your beautiful wife here,
It's
Maria.
my wife, Maria. God, she's so beautiful.
You're working a full-time job, and you're going to train, and not just like train and get good cardio in. Like your training is painful at times. Every time. Josiah, I watched one of your fights, and it's different watching a fight with someone you know in it. And there's times when you were winning, and I was like pumped up. And there was some times when you took some blows that, as someone who loves you, and Josiah and Maria in our life group at our house, it was hard to see. You gave some blows, but you took some shots too. And what in that moment like helps you decide like I'm not going to give up and I'm going to keep fighting?
I mean, a lot of it is just like there's so much prep that went into it. Like there'd be no point in like whether I'm winning the fight. Obviously, if I'm winning, I'll finish the fight. But at a point where I'm losing, where I want to quit, it's like, dude, I did so much like training, so much dieting, so much prayer and like mental like endurance to get to this moment. Like there's no point in quitting. Like you have to kill me or I'm going to win. And that's just how I, thought in that moment. And side note, this was the fight that I lost, and this guy plays it at the life group. I just lost like the day before. He's like, let's put on the fight. I'm like, let's do it, Tyler. Nah. And we're watching there, and it's a bunch of people just like watching me get destroyed. And I'm like, that was really fun, right, guys? But no, I laugh about it now, but it was a fun fight.
It was fun just watching you keep fighting, even though it was tough to see. And we've seen in our life group, there's times when there's desserts on the counter, and you just got to walk by it because you're training, you're cutting.
Everyone at Thanksgiving, like all day, everyone just ate in front of me. I could not eat. It sucked.
Man. What if I were to tell you, Josiah, that your future opponents are going to be bigger, badder, tougher, punch harder, greater technique on the ground, inflict more bodily harm to you? What if I told you that's what your future opponents are going to be like? What would you say to me?
I always welcome that because, I talked to one of my buddies about that, and I was like, when I have an easy day at my job, or like maybe there's days at work or at home where I'm getting stuff done, I'm like, oh, this was so easy, I love it. But if I'm training and it's an easy session, or if I like run through a dude and it's easy, I'm like, I actually suck. I'm beating guys who aren't good. But if it's like a war or it's just really competitive, that's how I know I'm getting better, because I'm in the right spot. Like you never want to be the biggest fish in the pond.
And so you're literally training right now, not just for the next opponent, but for the opponents after that are even bigger, stronger, and tougher. Mm-hmm. Okay, your last fight, you fought at the Muckleshoot Casino in front of a lot of people, and you got to experience a win, a victory on that stage. What did that feel like?
It was coming off the loss. So it was incredible. My family got to fly out, and my teammates and everybody, and just people I don't even know are like hugging me and trying to buy me beer and stuff, which was cool. But I'm just like, oh, okay, cool. But it was awesome. You give the glory to God, and like I was saying, no one really sees everything that I put into it, only except Him. So it was a really good moment. After I won, I wanted to cry, and I was just giving Him the glory.
I got a picture here of your hand raised in victory.
11 pounds ago.
Talk to me about just that moment of them. Fight's over, adrenaline's rushing, family, wife's looking at you. She's not covering her eyes anymore. That feeling of victory, the hand raised. Does that push you to experience that more?
It's the same with like the more we come to church, the more we do devotions, the more we're with people who are Christ-like minded, we want to grow. So the more I experience, like learning from losses is always tough, but the moments where I win, it's like, man, I'm just going to keep pursuing this because that's what God would want me to do. Like He's given me hands for battle. Why would I not use them?
Yeah. One of my favorite moments in Josiah's fight was once he was declared victory. And in the MMA world, there's what's called ring girls. And they came over to get a picture with him, and he was like, "Nah, I'm good," and refused the picture with the ring girls and went right to his wife. So even in the height of that moment, like, you maintained honor for your marriage. And so I just want to say I'm proud of you, and thanks for sharing. Thanks for doing what I'm not willing to do. And just want to let you know we're for you behind you. Can you give Josiah a hand and thank him for being here with us today?
Thank you so much. Love you. Appreciate it.
You see, Josiah's chosen something that's hard, and actually something that is guaranteed to be painful. And when he signed up for it, he knew what he was signing up for. What defines a successful church is the question I want to ask you today. What defines a successful church? Because in our world and life, we try to gravitate towards the easy. And when hard comes spiritually, or when hard comes to a person that claims to follow Jesus, many times that becomes confusing moments for us. Maybe you found yourself in that place where you're like, I didn't expect it to be this way. I thought it would be easier than this. I thought if I gave my life to Jesus, more things would go my way. And so when it comes to being a successful church, it's not about attendance. It's not about just numbers. It's not about programs or notoriety. It's not that everyone's happy. When it comes to being a successful church together, it is about faithfulness. It's about enduring. And it's about preparing ourselves for what lies ahead. And one of the things Revelation teaches us is that the road ahead for Jesus' church is difficult. It's difficult. It's full of obstacles. It's full of challenges. It's full of pain. It's full of opponents. And this is something we all know, but if we're only chasing comfort, it will lead to atrophy. If you only try to have a comfortable life, it'll lead to atrophy in your body. If you only try to chase a comfortable spiritual life, you will be a weak follower of Jesus. But here's the big idea for today's message, is that there is no problem that's greater than the promise of Jesus. There is no problem that's greater than the problem of Jesus. And we don't like problems. And I'm not saying that we should choose problems, but we should expect them to come. And we especially don't like problems that don't have quick solutions. And many of us expect it to be an easy, smooth road when it comes to following Jesus. And if you have that picture, I would say that you did not get that picture from the words of Christ, from the heart of Christ, and from the pattern for his church. You see, following Jesus will be the hardest and most costly thing you ever do in your life. Following Jesus will be the hardest and most costly thing you ever do in your life. And sometimes preparation and pain can go hand in hand. And we understand that in some life situations, whether it be the gym or competitions or dance or a new career and job, we can expect challenges. But what about when pain shows up spiritually? How often are we tempted to say, I'm out, I'm done, and I didn't sign up for this? Well, in Revelation chapter 2, verse 8, we see Jesus' letter to a church that's in difficulty. It's called the church at Smyrna. And Smyrna is about 35 miles north of Ephesus, the church we learned about last week. It's in modern-day Turkey. It's actually the only city that still remains from the 7 letters that were written to the 7 churches. And so it's a current city in Turkey. And it says this in verse 8, "Write to the angel of the church of Smyrna, thus says the first and the last, the one who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and poverty, but you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Look, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will experience affliction for 10 days. Be faithful to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has ears to hear listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers will never be harmed, by the second death. And so Jesus is writing to this church, and he's giving them a word of encouragement to help them endure in their time of testing and trial. A couple things that we just want to highlight in this passage that we're not going to get fully into the message, but we just want to highlight so there's clear understanding. There's a weird phrase in this passage that says there are Jews that we call a synagogue of Satan. That for many times and years has been used for some people to have some anti-Semitic rhetoric and thought in their mind. What's going on here is there's a large Jewish population in Smyrna, but they are not following Jesus, and they are persecuting Christians. So they're descendants of the line of Abraham, but they are not followers of the ways of Christ, and the devil, the enemy, is using them to persecute Jesus' church. So it's talking about a specific people in a specific time that had given their hearts over to the enemy, and they were not working with God, but they were actually actively working against God. And that broke God's heart. That his people who he had separated and called out, who he desired to save and be amongst the people, were actually working against his purposes. It also says you'll be thrown into prison for 10 days. This time frame, 10 days, is not an actual literal 10 days. It's talking about a definite period of time, saying that there will be a time of testing, and I'm going to give you a time frame to help you understand it's not one that lasts forever. You see, one of the questions we need to answer today is, where is God when it's difficult? Where is God when it's difficult? Because to this church that was in difficulty, I'm sure they hoped to receive this letter. And when they heard a letter was coming from John, specifically for them, I bet that their ideas and prayers were that Jesus was going to bring the difficulty to an end. That he was going to take care of all their problems. And all the problems they had been facing would have stopped. But yet that's not the message that Jesus brought. You see, one of the phrases for this city that would have been ingrained on statues and in places is this: the first in Asia. They took pride in that they were one of the first cities in Asia, one of the founding cities. And Jesus speaks to them and says, I am the first. I am the first. You may think that you were first, but before all this was, I am. And before all this came to being, and before everything that humans have created, know that God and Jesus were first, and they are in control. He was there at the beginning. He was also there at the cross, making a way, and he will be coming again at the end. And so in every moment in between, Jesus has remained in control. He said he was the one who was dead and came to life, that Jesus was victorious over death. He left the riches of heaven so that we could receive the riches of God. He became poor so that we could become rich. And he died so that we could live. And this is the encouragement he's bringing to this church. And he's also wanting them to know, and this is an important realization and truth for our lives, that suffering is not an indicator that God has failed you. When you face problems, when you face challenges, one of the first questions that come to our hearts and minds is, where's God? Has he forgotten me? Has he neglected me? Does he no longer care? And this letter to the church is a reminder that he sees all and he knows every circumstance of our life. And so when we face difficulty, when we face suffering, when we face what seems impossible, it's not an indicator that God has failed you. You see, the commands to the church and to our lives is we are to prepare for the heart. We're to prepare for the heart. We're not to prepare for the easy. We're actually to prepare for the hard and spiritually prepare for the hard. That there is time and there is testing coming, and this is what Revelation will ultimately point us to. That there is an end coming that Jesus' church needs to be prepared for. There is times of testing, times of difficulty, times of suffering that every church in every stage of human history has faced that you need to be prepared for. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, during Nazi Germany, when it was beginning to rise, he was a pastor in Germany, and he opened a seminary. And he opened this seminary and he invited young men to come in and train to become preachers. And he created one of the most rigorous seminaries that had ever been done. The work was hard. The demand on these future pastors was excruciating. So much so that people began to complain. Isn't that just us as humans? When things get hard, our complaining voices get loud, don't they? And so they began to complain. They're like, this is too hard. This is too much. You're asking too much out of us. Even these students' parents began to get involved. You're making this too hard on my precious little boy. Help him succeed. Help him thrive. We want him to become a minister. And finally, Dietrich Bonhoeffer got frustrated. And there was a time when someone says, you're making this too hard. And he literally pointed over to a Nazi soldier training camp. And he said this must be stronger than that. Our training of pastors and ministers must be stronger than what Hitler is training his troops to do. Church, we must be stronger than the world we enter into. You must raise your kids to be stronger than the schools you're sending them into. And even if you send them to private Christian school, that doesn't take away your opportunity to train them to live for God in any and every environment. And too many times we're not ready for the hard. We're not ready for the difficult. We're not prepared. We just want the blessings and promises of God, and we want them now. But yet tests and temptations are guaranteed. He speaks to this church and he says, I've seen your affliction. I've seen the difficulty, the burdens that weigh heavily on you. He says, I know your poverty. This church had given up a lot financially, economically, physically, religious and social oppression were present for every believer. They paid a price, and materially they had very little. But yet Jesus follows with these words, but I know you are rich. I know you are rich. What was their richness found in? The richness was found in that they treasured Christ. And is Christ your treasure? Not just someone you like, not just someone you love, but is he your treasure? You see, because when Christ becomes your treasure, there's nothing that can ever take that away. There's no circumstance, there's no words, there's no thoughts, there's no social or economic pressure that can rob you of the treasure of Christ. Now, you can abandon it, you can forfeit it, you can give it away, but when Christ becomes your treasure, he's all you need. So people can say what they want to say about you, but if you have Jesus, he's enough. People can do what they want to do towards you, but if you have Jesus, he's enough. You can walk through some challenges in your job and in your career and in your workplace for being a follower of Jesus and not cutting corners, not taking things just that help your company and compromise your integrity, but you can follow him and him be your treasure. And even if it costs you the things of this world, you can treasure Christ, and that's where your richness is found. He says suffering is coming. Oh, we don't like this. I want Jesus' healing. I want his miracles. I want his provision. And we can pray for those things. But Jesus says, I know what you've been through, but more problems are coming for this church. Some of you might have gotten up and left in that moment when that letter was written. You're like, I'm out. It's already been hard enough. And he says, some of you are going to go to prison. And I'm sure as the weeks went by, as the moments and gatherings, and as chairs inside that church would have become empty because of brothers and sisters in Christ going to jail, some of them even giving their lives. The reality of what this truth of the gospel means would have had to be evident to each and every one of them and decide whether they will continually, faithfully going forward. You see, when you're a fighter, you've got to learn how you're going to respond once you take a punch. And as a follower of Jesus, how are you going to respond when the enemy comes and attacks you? When he tests you? When he causes difficulty for you? And Jesus gave them this encouragement. He said, remain faithful. And then he put this description on it. Even to the point of death. Even to the point of death. And the threat of death has not stopped the church's witness. From the time that Jesus ascended into heaven and the Spirit fell on his disciples and they began to proclaim that Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not, their lives were put on the line. And no matter what local government or national government has been in place to try to stop the spread of the good news of Jesus, they have not been able to, because there has been a group of believers around the world that has been committed to the cause of Christ, even with the threat of death. And you may not know this, and I hope this is eye-opening to your hearts and souls. But in the history, anyone who gives their life for Jesus or loses their life for the sake of Christ, they're called martyrs, Christian martyrs. And that 65% of all people in the history of the world who have given their life for Jesus, who have lost their life for the sake of the gospel, 65% of those have happened in the last 40 years. That oppression and persecution is more rampant and prevalent now, today in the world, than it was even at the time that this letter was written. And so Jesus' church, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's in China or whether it's in other places where people are literally losing their lives, they're being arrested, they're being tortured, and they're refusing to back down. We need to be praying for Jesus' church. And we're going to pause right now and we're going to pray for his persecuted church. Would you bow your heads with me? Father, we're humbled that we can gather here today in freedom. But we know in many places around the world at this very moment, there are believers gathering and their lives are at stake. But yet they continue to gather, they continue to worship you, they continue to commune with one another, they continue to tell others about your glory. And so I pray that your angels would cause a hedge of protection around each and every one of them, around their hearts, their minds, their families, their churches. And God, but I pray that their spirit would be strong. That even in the face of opposition, even in the face of persecution, that they would not give in, they would not give up, and they would be faithful even to the point of death for your name and your glory. In Jesus' precious name, amen. Each month, 322 people, Christians, are killed for their faith. There are 214 churches and properties that are destroyed. There are 722 forms of violence, beatings, kidnappings, rape, arrest, etc. that are committed against Christians every month. Jesus' local church and global church is facing much difficulty and as much opposition as it ever has. And if COVID highlighted anything to the American church, it's that we're not ready for affliction, poverty, and suffering. And as a pastor, that's concerning to me. As your shepherd, I was convicted as I read this, am I preparing our church for the hard? Or are we liking to sing some great songs and enjoying being together, and we leave feeling good, but we're not preparing ourselves for the hard that is ahead, for a faith that will last, for a faith that will be tested? You see, there was a quote I read this week that was challenging to me. It says, those who oppose and reject Christianity are going to oppose and persecute us. Not only will they say we are wrong, they will say we are bigoted, dangerous, and evil. We will be slandered as anti-choice, anti-diversity, anti-gay, anti-inclusion, anti-intolerance. And we can anticipate economic boycotts, governmental restrictions, and social ostracization. Eventually, more severe persecution and even imprisonment will likely be our experience. The way our country is headed in the social and cultural pressures, I don't know what lies ahead. And this isn't to cause fear in our hearts, but is to say my faith will be ready. As the pastor of this church, I understand my responsibility. I also understand that if change were to come, I would be the number one target, me and my family. And so I understand the responsibility that comes with this role, and I am committed to being faithful to God in all things and through all things, even to the point of death. You see, we're not to fear it, but we are to prepare for it. We are to be ready. And I believe this with all the conviction in my heart, that Jesus is worth living for. That there is life in him that's found only in him. And he came to give us life to the full. And so I choose to live for him. But if required, I am convicted and convinced that Jesus is also worth dying for. That there is nothing in this world or in this life that you could offer me that would cause me to forfeit my faith or forfeit my testimony or recant that Jesus is Lord. You see, this life is not all there is. Trials don't last for eternity, and death is not the end. And so Jesus' church is to be ready. It's to be prepared. And the promised prize is for when the race is over. Here in the passage, he says, don't be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Look, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison to test you, and you will experience affliction for 10 days. Be faithful to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Many of us don't want to go through trials and testings. We just want the crown now. We just want the crown mid-race. My friend Carly here runs for Central Washington. They don't declare the winner until the race is over. You don't get to be halfway in the race and raise your arm in victory. Stand and take a picture for your parents. You're going to lose. And many times we journey with Christ and we come to the starting line. And Jesus says, go. And we begin running. I'm going to run slow motion so I don't lose my breath. We begin running, and then difficulty comes. Things begin to hurt. Our finances might suffer. God asks you to give to his church, and you're like, oh, that kind of hurts. That means less for me. You start running. The church has opportunities to serve. I don't have time to serve. I didn't know what this race was all about. You start running, and you look, and you've got no friends around you anymore. Because you're making stands for Jesus, and they're different than the stands of this world. And not because you've abandoned your friends, but they began to leave you, and so you feel alone. And many times at some point, you begin to say, this is too hard. Where's my crown? And Jesus says, if you will remain faithful, the crown is at the finish line. The crown is when you've completed the race. The crown is when you've been faithful to the last breath, and that death is not your end anymore. You see, this world fears death because to them, death is the end. But for a believer in Jesus, death is not the end. Death is the beginning of new life forever with him. It's the beginning of his presence. And he speaks here that says, you don't need to fear the first death because I've defeated the second death. There's two deaths in this life. There's our physical death when our life here on earth ends. But there's also a spiritual death for those that aren't in relationship with God, that they are not with him, they are not for him, they have not given their lives to him. And so that second death becomes an eternal death, an eternal separation from God, eternity spent apart from him in a place called hell or Hades. But for those that are in Jesus, for those that have run this race faithfully to the end, you receive the crown of life, and it's the victor's crown. It's the victor's crown. It's not a mid-race accolation. It's not a feel-good moment or an easy path. It is a strenuous journey to get to the end faithfully. It is one full of problems, full of suffering, and full of heartache. But when you receive that victor's crown, those things are no more. There's no more pain. There's no more tears. There's no more disappointment. There's no more hardship. It's just time in his presence forever with God's people. And that's why we run. And if we're not willing to give him the things he asks for now, we won't be willing when it gets harder. And that's my concern for this church in this region. If we're not willing to faithfully serve, if we're not willing to get out of bed and get to church on a Sunday, if we're not willing to give of our time and our finances and make those sacrifices, when the harder comes, if we're not willing to do it now, we won't be willing to do it then. You see, we can't avoid the difficult. We see suffering as a punishment rather than a test to give God glory. Some of you are going to make it through some things, and others are going to be like, I don't know how you made it through. And you're like, I don't either without Jesus. But because I have Jesus, and because he is the first and last, because he's conquered death, whatever I have before me, his promises are greater than the difficulty I'm facing. You see, strength comes through preparation. And just because you experience some challenges doesn't mean that God's not with you. I was talking with Pastor Tyler and Pastor Nate. We were here on Tuesday and we were talking about this message and just how we really like to avoid the hard when it comes to faith. There's other areas in life that we'll sign up for hard. We'll get in a relationship knowing that it's going to be challenging. We'll have kids. You signed up for hard when you chose to have kids. We'll take a hard job because it's got good pay. We'll sign up for CrossFit because we want a bodily injury at some point. We'll sign up for hard. But when it comes to faith, we think we're signing up for easy. And Pastor Tyler said this, and this thought has been resonating in my heart. He's like, it's almost like when we signed up for faith, we want God to take all of the weights out of the weight room. And I began to think about that. What's a weight room with no weights? Sounds amazing, actually. Pumping iron with no iron. Sounds awesome. Actually, I'm going to go to the YMCA and Puyallup and make a suggestion. Hey, if you could take all the weights out of the weight room, we could fill this place. If we put in chairs that relaxed, if you had a concession stand and 85-inch TVs everywhere, we could pack this place out. But that's not what it's designed for. Weights without a weight room is no longer preparation to get stronger. A church that isn't prepared for problems is no longer willing to live by faith, and they'll start living by sight. A church that's not prepared for problems will no longer lean in through prayer, but you'll begin to operate out of your flesh. A church that's no longer prepared for problems will crumble when difficulty comes. And there are things that we face that are hard. I'm walking through that right now. We bury my grandmother tomorrow. My dad's in the hospital right as we speak. His heart is really struggling. I ask for your prayers. Those things are really hard, but we don't fear a first death. And the comfort I have is that my grandma, man, she was faithful until her last breath. My father, his physical heart may be failing, but his love for God has never failed. It's never wavered. His love for his family remains strong, and God has been faithful. And so we don't fear a first death, even though it's difficult. And in our lives and in our world, for a believer, death equals instant heaven. And John's challenge is this: are you listening? There is an eternal reward and eternal promise if you stay with Jesus no matter what. And there is glory on the other side. You see, Pastor Paul Tripp said this: hardship in the hands of the Redeemer is the workshop of his grace. And some of you are in a difficult place, and everything inside of you wants to quit and give up. You feel like God's forgotten you. You feel like he doesn't see you, and you just want it to become easy. Yet God would speak to you today, and he says, stay faithful. I see what you're enduring. I see the afflictions you've gone through, and stay faithful to the end. Because if you're faithful to the end, there is a crown of life that will be placed on your head that can never be taken away. Approximately 60 years after this letter was delivered to the church in Smyrna, there was a man who was faithful until the end. He was the pastor of the church in Smyrna. His name was Polycarp, and he had been a disciple of John. And in AD 155, Polycarp would be arrested, he'd be quickly tried, and he would die for his faith. He was burned at the stake and then stabbed to finish the job by the local officials. He was old, and some tried to encourage him to take the route of comfort. They said, what is there to say? What harm is there just to say that Caesar is Lord? Burn some incense to Caesar and you can save yourself. He was told by the local proconsul, curse Christ. But Polycarp, he refused to say Caesar is Lord. And he said, 86 years I have served him, and he never did me any wrong. How can I blaspheme the king who saved me? Before he was burned alive, he prayed these words: I bless thee, my God, because thou hast deemed me worthy of this day and hour to take my part in the number of martyrs. For this and for everything, I praise thee, I bless thee, and I glorify thee. And with the sound of his voice, with his last words, he stayed faithful until the end. Life Center Rainier, may we never give up on the King who saved us, no matter how difficult it gets. Would you stand?